Chapter 24 of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Idol Crushed. Some minutes passed, that always seemed to Constance as though they had been hours. Then she spoke, quietly and firmly. "Come, I think you can walk now. We are going back for the child. Where did you leave him? Poor unhappy mother, do not add to your misery by committing an awful sin. No, you shall not go that way. Don't you know, poor creature, that you are not ready to die? Besides, you have no right to die, not yet. You are to live and take care of your boy." "I can't," sobbed the small shrinking creature. "I can't do it. Oh, haven't I tried? I am too weak and sick to work. Nobody will take us in, and sometimes he has been hungry. My baby! He cried tonight for more bread, and I had none for him. I can't bear it any longer. If I were out of the way, he would find plenty of friends. People stop on the street to look at him. He is so handsome. It is the only thing I can do for him." "You are to take care of him," said Constance firmly, moving forward as she spoke. "Take me to him. I will help you. He shall not cry again for bread. It is terrible that you were willing to leave him all alone on the cruel streets. I did not know a mother could do that." "I did not leave him on the streets," the mother moaned. "He is in a garden, asleep. It is a lovely garden, and he is wild over flowers. The woman who lives there admires him. She has spoken kindly to him more than once, and only yesterday she said she wished he was her little boy. She would be good to him, I am sure, if I were out of the way. They were not at home tonight, but I thought they would be sure to come after a while and find him. But he might have waked up and been afraid. Oh, he might have tried to follow me and been hurt. I did not think of that." She quickened her steps at the thought, breaking presently into almost a run, panting for breath as she went. Manifestly she was still a child. Having deliberately planned to desert her boy and destroy herself for his sake, at the first suggestion that he might awaken and be afraid, all her strength spent itself in an effort to get to him at once. They passed Mrs. Bristow's door, and Constance looked at it with a strange feeling that it stood for a refuge which had been hers, and which had slipped away from her. Lights were twinkling in the mother's room upstairs. They had wearied of waiting for her, and gone to their safe, quiet rest, and she was out in the night, wrestling with temptation and sin. The city clock was tolling midnight when she reached that door again. She had a firm arm about a shrinking woman, and grasped by the hand a large-eyed, wondering little boy. Mrs. Bristow's bell never rang with a more resolute peal than it did at that moment. In response, Mrs. Bristow's head appeared for a single second at the hall window, and then, very soon afterward, the bolt was slipped. "Pity's sake, child! Have you got home at last? I knew they must be worse over at Carter's when you stayed so. I told Kate after I got to bed that I believed I ought to have run over there and seen if more help was needed. How is it? Can I do anything? Dear me, what's the matter?" For Constance had arrested the voluble tongue that had begun before the bolt was fairly slipped, by gently pushing forward her charges into the hall, and she closed the street door before she replied. "I found an old acquaintance on the street, Mrs. Bristow. She is homeless and in trouble. May I put her and her little boy into my room for the night, and tomorrow I will see what can be done?" "Surely," said Mrs. Bristow, all her heart in her eyes. "Homeless, is she? Poor thing! And the dear little boy! A fatherless child, I suppose? And they're hungry as likely as not. Ellen, I'll run right down and warm some broth, and bring some milk and bread and things." Her abounding hospitality was with difficulty held in check, and it was more than an hour later when Constance, both of her charges sleeping, the one the healthful rest of childhood, the other the heavy sleep of overtaxed vitality, felt at liberty to steal away to Alice's vacant room, and dropping herself into the little sewing chair, clasp her fingers to her eyes to shut out the still glowing moonlight, and think. Could she think? Would her nerves that for hours had been under such rigid control obey her still, or must she give way to passionate emotion of some sort? She withdrew her hands from her face and clasped them in a passion of agony, then hurried them over her face again. She could not endure the moonlight. There were moonlight memories that stabbed her. She had just been stabbed afresh, the bitterest wound of her life. She knew it. She had been sure of it out there on the streets when she had made herself speak quietly to that half-mad creature and control her. All the time, all these years, she had steadied her heart upon one belief, never after those first awful hours allowing it to be shaken. Gordon Curtis had believed that he made her his wife, had believed that that other wife and her child were dead, and that he was free to put his sorrowful past away from him and begin life again. She had told herself that she knew this was so. Therefore, when they had appeared to him that day as from a grave, and she had fled away to give him his chance, he had met the issue as a man who was true, and who meant at all cost to be true, would have to meet it. There was no other way. And he had gone on since, living his changed life as well as he could, living down the pain and the shame of it all, and showing a gaping world that whatever he might have been in the past, he was a man now, one who had sinned perhaps, and suffered, but who had begun again, and was worthy to be trusted. This picture she had hung firmly in the gallery of her memory, and through the long months had looked upon no other. Continually she had schooled herself to think of him as a married man who was living his honorable life and finding a measure of peace in the honor of it. She had not known until this night how she had hugged the picture to her heart. How she had assured herself 1,000 times that, however black it looked, he had not meant it, not for her. And he had believed that the mistakes and the sins of his boyhood had a right to be things of the past, so long as his life then stood for truth and honor and righteousness. And the picture had been shattered into fragments. They had confronted him, his wife and child. He must have known at the first glance that the child was his, yet he had spurned them, driven them out into the streets to make their way through this terrible world alone. If he could do this, might he not have known all the time that he was speaking tender words to her, known even when he stood with her at the marriage altar, and in tones that she could not make herself forget, had vowed to love and cherish her, and her only, until death did them part, that one who had a right to call herself his wife was waiting then for him to come? It will be readily understood that to a woman like Constance there could be no heavier blow than this. She had been true to her inmost convictions when she told Dilsey that love between man and woman which was not founded upon respect was not worthy of the name. Consciously through these awful months she had clung to pieces of her idol, shattered though it was, and now they had crumbled into dust before her. There had been no honor, no truth to build upon. It was a very quiet woman who came to Mrs. Bristow next morning while her charges were still sleeping. The pallor of her face and the heavy rings under her eyes startled and shocked that good woman. "Pity's sake," she said, "you look like death. I don't believe you slept a wink. I knew you wouldn't. If you had just let me fix up Alice's room for them, I could have done it in a jiffy, and then you wouldn't have been upset. I can't sleep in a strange room myself. I declare it's too bad. And now I suppose they'll hinder you from getting started for the country today, and you oughtn't to be in this heat another 24 hours. Will they hinder you? Who are they, anyway, and what are you going to do with them?" Such easy questions to ask. How were they to be answered? "It is about that trip to the country that I want to talk," said Constance, ignoring the other questions. "I must give it up altogether, Mrs. Bristow. I have been thinking and planning half the night. It was that which kept me awake. This woman is one who, for many reasons, and especially for Christ's sake, I must help. She is quite alone in the world, an orphan who has been deserted by her husband—" "The wretch!" interpolated Mrs. Bristow. "She is failing in health and strength, and has utterly failed in courage. I found her on the street last night just at the verge of desperation. I must stand between her and this hard world, Mrs. Bristow, and save her child. There is no one else." "Dear, dear!" said Mrs. Bristow. "And that pretty child, too. It is just a shame. But what in the world can you do, Ellen? I don't see, I'm sure." "I do," said Constance quietly. "It is all planned. The hardest part is that I must leave you. I shall have to go to housekeeping. That is what I expected to do, you remember, when I first came to you, but I got to work so promptly, and you were so very good to me when I was at home, that I had given up all idea of it. Now I must find rooms where I can do light housekeeping, and where a child can be cared for properly, and then I think I can manage. I can teach her to look after the rooms and get their meals while I am away at work, and I believe with economy that I can earn enough to keep us three. I have quite a little start, you know. But this vacation must, of course, be given up." "There's something else must be given up, too," said Mrs. Bristow, with her most determined air. "Don't you go to talking about finding rooms. It's a great big thing to try to do, and an awful responsibility, with a boy, too, to look after. But then, if them that ought to shoulder the responsibility have shirked it, I don't see anything else but to pick it up so far as it has tumbled right down at your feet. You used to know her when she was a girl, I s'pose? Well, there isn't one woman in 100 would do such a thing. But then you're that woman, and I reckon Susan Bristow is the one that can help you a little. It's all happening in just the nick of time. Don't you think our dressmaker is going to get married? Isn't that news? I was just beat when she told me of it last night. I couldn't wait for a chance to tell you about it. And then to think that it was all driven out of my mind. Well, it's in her mind anyway. I hope she won't repent it. Dear, dear, what a chance getting married is, to be sure. They each think they've got the only good man in the world, too. She wants to go right off next week. It seems it's real sudden. That is, something has happened so that he can get married now instead of waiting till next spring as they had planned. And man-like, he wants her to rush right off without any wedding dresses nor anything. She said she would pay a month's rent because she hadn't given notice, but I don't suppose they have any too much money, and I told her if I could rent the rooms right off, she needn't pay any extra rent. So now I've done it, don't you see? You'll rent the 2 rooms and set up your family as fine as a fiddle, and the girls and I will do what we can to spoil the boy for you." It was then that Constance cried, the first tear she had shed since this new trouble came upon her. "Poor child!" said the motherly voice, as its owner bent over to pat the wet cheek as though it had belonged to a child indeed. "You're all tuckered out, and I don't wonder. There is nothing that upsets a body like losing a night's rest. Well, now you just help me take hold and help about this whole thing. I like work first rate, when I can see something to get hold of and know just what to do. Kate and Marion will be tickled to death over having a child in the house, and Alice too, for that matter. She's dreadfully fond of children." The good woman had her way, and carried out most of her plans to the letter. The only point to which Constance held steadily was that the trip to the country should not be given up, so far as the Bristows were concerned. Mrs. Bristow was for a time fully resolved that she would not stir one step, but vigorous argument prevailed. Constance assured her that it would really be the kind way for them all. Left alone with her charges, she could get them accustomed to their new surroundings, and to feeling a little bit at home before coming in contact with strangers. Besides, it would be much better for— and then Constance came to a distinct pause, and considered, and began again. It will be better for Mrs. Curtis to have something to do from the very first. She has had heavy sorrow, and needs to have her thoughts occupied with necessary commonplaces to keep her from brooding over her wrongs. Mrs. Curtis? Repeated the elder woman curiously. Is that her name? And you say her husband deserted her? Poor thing! Constance hurried on. If I am quite alone in the house, Mrs. Bristow, for a time, she will feel the need of rousing herself to help me, and in doing so will help herself. Besides, don't you know you promised Alice? What will the dear girl think if her mother disappoints her? This was the argument which was potent. The mother had a feeling that no minor disappointments which could be averted ought to touch Alice's life. She had borne enough. I am glad day and night, she once said to Constance, that puppy deserted my girl. I never could abide him, though I tried to excuse his doings for Alice's sake. But there, I believe a mother's instincts tell her who not to trust. And the days aren't long enough for me to be thankful in that it has turned out as it has. But for all that, it was a hard blow to Alice. I'm sure I hope I can forgive him, as a Christian should, for what he has made her suffer. By dint of many words and much exertion, Constance was able to watch Mrs. Bristow and Kate on the car that would connect with the train for which Alice would be waiting. I don't know what the child will say when she sees us coming without you, shouted back Mrs. Bristow as she ran for the car. Constance, watching from the doorway, saw that she caught it, and gave one regretful sigh for that rest in the country before she turned back to take up her new burden. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Economy and Cake. There are continual proofs all along our way, if our eyes were but trained to see them, of the wisdom and kindness of the Father in shading the future from our gaze. There were times during the remainder of that summer and the winter following, when Constance admitted to herself that, had she known all about the weight she was shouldering that August morning, she might have cried out that it was too heavy for her and let it slip. The grown-up child who thus came under her care was certainly a charge sufficient to make strong hearts hesitate. Undisciplined she was in every sense of the word, grown to womanhood in years, and a very child in judgment or in patience. Her whims and her fancies, and above all her tempers, were sometimes more than it seemed that mortal patience could suffer. For that matter they were. It was divine patience that took up the burden and counseled his child, Constance, to be content with the lighter end. But for this she must have sunken. Prominent in the lists of responsibilities came financial questions. To keep house for 3 and pay rent for 2 good-sized rooms on the second floor, instead of renting a room and a closet on the third floor, and averaging 1 meal a day with a woman like Mrs. Bristow, taxed the reserve fund to its utmost, and caused Constance hours of troubled calculation as to whether her earnings, provided she was always well and able to work, would meet the demands. Mrs. Bristow was kindness personified. She not only insisted upon materially reducing the rent of the 2 rooms, but she threw in, as she called it, a little hall bedroom which, when all chamber furniture was removed, made a respectable dining room and kitchen for the very light housekeeping that was to be undertaken. Constance was distressed at the good woman's sacrifice, but her arguments were scoffed at. The hall bedroom was too small for a sleeping room anyhow, Mrs. Bristow said. She had always felt mean renting it and letting a great big man sleep in such a tucked-up place, but it would make quite a nice little dining room for 3, unless, indeed, Constance would get over being stubborn, and would come down and eat her meals with them, as she wanted her to, and as a civilized family should. But Constance remained stubborn to the end. She could not assume the financial responsibilities of dual housekeeping with Mrs. Bristow as provider. Besides, she knew how dear to her heart had been that faithful woman's scheme of keeping a home sacred to herself and her children. Constance had been away so much, and had become so entirely one with them, that she knew she was in no sense an intruder, but Pauline and the child would be different. "No," she said firmly, "we will live under your roof, since you are good and will have it so, and we will be grateful every day of our lives for a large piece of home that the arrangement gives us. But we will be a little family to ourselves. It will be better for the child, and for Pauline as well." The use of her maiden name instead of the one belonging to a married woman had been Constance's first concession to what seemed to her like childish fright. The small creature had cowed and trembled and cried out as if in pain when Constance first addressed her as Mrs. Curtis. "Not that name," she moaned. "Oh, don't call me that. I shall die if you do. I don't want to hear it nor think about it." "Why not?" Constance had asked sternly. "Haven't you a right to that name?" "Oh, yes," she said, shrinking and weeping. I have indeed. It is as true as heaven that that name belongs to me, but, you see, I am afraid. There are others to whom it belongs, and some of them hate me. Oh, I know they do. They would kill me if they could, and I am afraid." "That is nonsense," Constance had said, still sternly. "No one bearing that name wants you or tries to find you. I should think you had at least proved that. Didn't you try?" But the miserable little woman sank on the couch in an abject fit of sobbing and begging. "Oh, you don't know, I tell you. You weren't there. If I have got to hear that name, it will kill me. I cannot bear it." And then Constance looked at her pitifully, with a strange tightening of the cords about her heart. What must that frail, childish creature have been made to suffer, on the morning when she was spurned afresh, to have made of her such a physical and mental wreck? "Never mind," she had said, when the paroxysm of coughing had subsided that violent emotion was sure to induce, and she spoke as she might have done to soothe a frightened child. "Never mind, then. I will call you Pauline if you wish, and in turn you are to remember that I am Ellen Stewart. That is my maiden name, and I am never to be called by any other." At this announcement Pauline had stopped crying, and had gazed at her in what seemed to be wide-eyed fright, and Constance, troubled lest the creature's reason was going, had soothed and petted her into quiet, and hushed her to sleep as she would have done for a sick child, and had resolved thereafter to let all petty matters alone, and think of her charge as only an ill-treated child whom God had told her to care for in his stead. Mrs. Bristow almost furnished the little hall room. It astonished Constance even to laughter to find how fertile the careful housekeeper was in discovering articles of furniture that had suddenly grown too large or too small for her own use. In truth, the younger woman had to watch and entreat, and sometimes to grow stubborn even to sternness, not to have the Bristow dining room and kitchen quite robbed of its conveniences for her sake. By the time the summer had waned, and Alice had returned again to her school, and the world in general had taken on its after-summer attire and occupations, the curiously reconstructed home was in general working order. But before the new household, the financial problem remained. Constance had planned that the newcomer should have the ordering of the meals and what preparation of them was necessary during her absence. But she learned early in the course of her experiment that she could not safely throw off even this responsibility. It was found that Pauline would make delicious cake, and lovely desserts, and creams and ices that would tempt the palate of an epicure. Moreover, they tempted her, or at least the making of them did, too often for a slender purse. The first week that she took full charge, the bill for luxuries alone exceeded the sum that Constance had planned as sufficient for their entire food supply. Pauline cried when this was pointed out to her, and declared that she had ordered just as little of everything as she possibly could. She had actually felt ashamed to tell the milkman that she wanted such a little bit of cream, and that her aunt, who was always "fussing over bills," never thought of a smaller order for fruit than she had given. Then, when Constance remained firm, she waxed sarcastic, and said that if she had understood that they were not to live, but just to starve respectably from day to day, she might perhaps have managed differently. If Ellen must have things done on such a fearfully small scale, she would better attend to it herself. She, Pauline, was not constituted so that she could. When she had money she spent it, and when she hadn't she went without. Those were the only ways she knew. Constance listened in astonishment. Here was a new phase of the child woman's character, calling for patience in a direction that she had not expected. She gave the matter some hours of careful thought, not without more figuring and a small sacrifice or two that she had held in abeyance, then very kindly and firmly laid down her laws. She admitted that Pauline had evidently not been accustomed to planning in a house in which people were poor. She had spent much of her life in boarding, and had not, in any case, known what it cost simply to live. She, Ellen, knew. She had ordered her uncle's house for him years ago, and understood what she was talking about, and knew also to a penny just what they had to depend upon. They would try not to starve. "Charlie has sometimes cried for bread, you told me," she said. "God helping us, he shall never cry for bread again. But the cream, and the candies, and the luxuries generally, must be few and rare. I must do all the buying hereafter, and I must plan what we may have to eat. That is what I should have done in the first place, because of course I am the only one who knows just how much money there is to be spent. Besides, it will save you the calculations that you say you hate." And then Pauline had cried again, in another mood, and told Constance that she was as good as an angel, and was doing, oh, so much more for her than she deserved. She ought to be pushed out into the street and left to starve, and if it were not for poor Charlie, she would not care. And this mood was almost harder for Constance than the other. But there were other things that Pauline could do. She could broil a steak to a crisp, so that it was impossible for even Charlie's boyish appetite to relish it. And she could make vegetables sodden with improper cooking, and plan her fire so that her mutton was hopelessly raw one day, and hopelessly burned the next. "On general principles," said Mrs. Bristow, who was looking on ill-pleased, "whatever that creature ought to have cold, she warms, and whatever ought to be piping hot is as cold as a stone. That child," continued the notable housekeeper, pouring out the story of her anxieties to Alice when she came home on Friday evenings, "that child," meaning always Constance, "is just about starved to death. She comes home at night all fagged out. She works later than she used to, and she's been working all the week where they don't care whether or not there is anything left for the help to eat. And that creature will have a slop of scorched soup for her that is just milk warm, or a piece of warmed over fish. If there is one thing more than another that I can't abide, it is warmed over fish. Of course Ellen can't eat. She's lost, I don't know how many pounds already. She'll be just a skeleton by spring. That creature don't know how to cook any more than my shoes know how to preach. I don't mean to stand this much longer. I mean to do something." Before the holidays were upon them, she had done it. "What do you know how to do anyway?" she had asked Pauline one day, when that "poor creature," which was Mrs. Bristow's commonest name for her, had been confiding the sorrows of her cut finger and burned wrist and heavy gems to what she hoped was a sympathetic ear. "You don't seem to me to be cut out for a cook, now that's a fact. I was wondering if there wasn't something you could do real well and liked to do." "Indeed there is," said Pauline with animation. "I don't believe anybody can make lovelier cake than I can. I know how to make 15 different kinds, and they are all just lovely. I used to make my aunt's cake always. But oh dear, it's of no use to make any here. Helen hardly ever eats a piece, and she thinks I oughtn't to let Charlie eat it. And more than that, she thinks she can't afford to have it made. I don't see why not, I'm sure. Cake doesn't take much, just a little butter and sugar and a few eggs." "Cake is very expensive stuff," said the experienced housekeeper with decision. "We only have it occasionally for a kind of treat. But there's lots of folks in this city who do have it all the time. And I was wondering, what if you and I should get up a little secret and surprise Ellen all to pieces? Suppose you make some cake and I'll sell it for you. Maybe you could make money enough to have your meat and your gems and all such things cooked for you. How should you like that?" The mercurial little woman, who had been crying but a few minutes before, clapped her hands for joy. "Like it?" she said. "That isn't the word. I should love it. I've never told Ellen, and I wouldn't for the world, because she is just an angel, and what we should do without her it frightens me to think. But for all that, I hate, hate, hate cooking and dishwashing. I was never used to it, and I can't learn it." Mrs. Bristow looked at the small, frail creature with compassion in her eyes. "You poor sickly little good-for-nothing thing," she said to herself. "I don't suppose you've got the strength to do housework, even if you had the gumption, which you haven't." Then she set her energies to work with such success that by the close of that same week Pauline, as pleased as a child with a new toy, slipped into Constance's astonished hand $3 silver that she had earned. "And paid for the eggs and the sugar and things besides," she explained gleefully. "Mrs. Bristow stood over me like an old ogre and made me weigh every grain I used." "Now, child," began Mrs. Bristow to Constance, when their charge and her little boy were safe in bed for the night, "it's time for you to listen to reason. Haven't I got eyes and a nose? And can't I see how your hard-earned money is being put into the fire and the garbage pail? The poor creature doesn't know how to cook, and you can't teach her. It ain't in her. And when it isn't in them, they can't learn. But she can make wonderful cake. Mrs. Morris Wheelock went most into hysterics over it, and wants more right away, and so does Mrs. Carter Wheelock, across the street from her. And what those two women want, every blessed woman on that square intends to have. So it's as good a settled route already. Now here's my plan. I can cook, you know that just as well as I do, and I'll cook up your things for you every day when I do mine. I'd just as soon do it as not, for neighborliness, but you are so dreadful independent that we'll be businesslike. You can pay me regular each week for doing your cooking and washing up your dishes with mine. And she can help earn the money. She says she just loves to make cake, and I guess she does. It would have done you good to see what pleasure the poor thing took in foaming her eggs and creaming her butter and sugar. Well now, isn't that a good plan? I think it is first rate. And if you get stubborn and don't take to it, that poor creature and I will both be downright mad. Besides, there's Alice. Mother, says she, when she was here last week, if you don't make Ellen do something different, I'm afraid she will get sick. She looks thinner and paler every time I come." Constance laughed, even while a gleam as of tears shone in her eyes. It was balm to her tired heart to feel that these dear friends were plotting for her. She had no idea of being stubborn, she assured the anxious plotter. On the contrary, she was distinctly grateful. The scheme was worthy of the one who had thought of it, and her heart would thereby be relieved of a great anxiety, for indeed, with all her care, they were running a little behind in expenses, so much food had been spoiled. Also, she had become aware that the burden laid on Pauline was too heavy, and had not known what could be done. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. A Neighbor. There followed some weeks of as much comfort as could be had with a woman like Pauline as one of the family. It was probably a greater relief to Constance than she realized that she was compelled to be much away. She had leisure afterward to understand how much of her own burden was shouldered by good Mrs. Bristow, who, now that she had the right of way into the little dining room at all hours, watched over the household with the eyes of an expert. "And that Pauline will bear watching any time," she confided to Kate. "She can't just help wasting. It's born in her." Other traits than this were also born in the poor wreck of womanhood. Her mercurial disposition had always saved her reason to her, but it made strange scenes that puzzled a woman like Mrs. Bristow. There were times when she would go wild with delight over some trivial matter, capering about the room and yielding to her glee with the abandonment of a merry child, and perhaps within the next 5 minutes she would give way to an equally uncontrollable burst of grief, with apparently as trivial a cause as before. She alternately played with her boy as if she were even younger than he, and fretted at his mistakes and lapses in behavior as an irritable older sister might have done. Or on comparatively slight provocation, she would be fiercely angry with him, and administer punishment out of all proportion to the fault. On one of these occasions the punishment was so severe that Mrs. Bristow, who was a woman of strong good sense, and who had resolved years before that happen what might she would never interfere between other people and their children, broke her resolution, and sternly told the angry mother that if she struck her child again she would be put in the other room and have the door locked upon her. Then there followed such a passionate outburst of weeping, not from the child, but on the part of the child mother, that her little boy put away his sobs and came over and patted her face and caressed her hand, and said in tones of infinite tenderness, "Poor mamma, poor little mamma, don't cry. I will never be naughty any more." As usual, the crying was followed by coughing, a paroxysm so severe and prolonged that Mrs. Bristow ran hither and thither for restoratives and reliefs, and was in a fever of anxiety and remorse for the remainder of the day. Poor Constance, when the scene was reported to her in graphic detail by the half-triumphant, half-penitent elder woman, could not help an outburst of laughter over some of the absurdities connected with the occasion, but in the quiet of her locked room a little later she did not laugh. Instead, her mouth was drawn in tense lines of pain. What a strange wife the untrained, undisciplined creature must have made! So utterly unlike, was it any wonder that— But there she stopped, and told herself not to drop so low in the scale of being that she wanted to condone sin. One gleam of comfort during those days that were in many respects soul-trying, the two elder women had. The boy, Charlie, if he could have been spoiled, certainly would have been by them both, so entirely had their hearts gone out to him. No more lovable specimen of childhood had ever come within their range. There were times when Mrs. Bristow admitted that even Alice, her firstborn, was not always as good as Charlie. The child's singular beauty, that seemed to grow with his years, attracted even strangers to him, and his singularly lovable disposition was sure to win any who saw much of him. One of his most surprising characteristics was a marked power of self-control, a power that would have been surprising in one so young, even though carefully trained by the wisest of parents, and under the circumstances seemed nothing less than a marvel. There must have been some good grandmother or maybe grandfather that he copied in looks and disposition, Mrs. Bristow remarked once, when the boy's unusual traits were being discussed. He isn't one mite like his mother in anything, that's certain, and it isn't likely that he is like his father, though since I have come to know that poor creature, I can't help thinking he might have had some excuse for slipping away, poor wretch. I don't mean that either, not a word of it. Any father who could go away and leave a child like Charlie to the care of, to the care of anybody, isn't fit to live on this earth. He went away before Charlie was born, said Constance quickly, and in a moment she was sorry she had revealed even so much. Why had she done it? Was it still sweet to her to hear someone try to find excuse for him? But they did what they could, all of them, to atone to Charlie for the trials of his short life. He was steadily loyal to his mother, and developed with each passing day a singularly protective air toward her, as if he instinctively recognized her need of being cared for, instead of bestowing care. But his love for all the others was strongly marked. Alice Bristow and he were friends from the first moment of their meeting, and he sought Kate and the younger sister Marian as companions at every opportunity. Still it was, after all, to Constance that he gave a chivalrous devotion that was as winning as it was unusual. "You'll be taken care of anyhow," said Mrs. Bristow to Constance, with a nod toward the boy, who was in sight but not within hearing. "You ought to have heard him tell this morning about what he is going to do for Aunt Ellen when he gets to be a man. Nothing that this world can furnish are you to be without, if he can help it. And what about your mother? I asked him. Oh, I'll take care of mamma, of course, he said with that air of protection that he puts on, you know. And then, Mrs. Bristow, Aunt Ellen will have a carriage all her own, just big enough for 2 people to ride in, and a pony, no, 2 ponies, because she might want to go very fast. He'll do it, too, see if he doesn't. That boy is going to make a man to be proud of. I just like to think that you'll have him to take care of you after I'm gone." Constance could not answer a word. She went over to Charlie, and putting her arms about him, kissed him with such clinging tenderness that, as he returned the caress, he said, "Aunt Ellen, do you love me more than ever today? So do I you, more and more every day. Isn't it funny?" But she could not speak, this poor, hungry, lonely heart. Would the boy be hers some day, with no one to come between them? Would he love her and protect her and be true everywhere and always? Was this to be God's gift to her out of the furnace? All things considered, the winter passed rapidly, and there was a degree of comfort in the home. Pauline, busy with her cake, as ever an artist with his paints and brushes, was almost happy while it was in preparation, and was certainly a financial success. Pauline, who confessed that she had never cared for money merely as money, brought her gains each week to Constance, indifferent as to what became of them, and there was now each week a little to put aside for a time of need, as Constance once vaguely expressed it, then exchanged apprehensive glances with Mrs. Bristow, and wondered if Pauline had heard. Did she know yet, she who talked so carelessly about death, often declaring that she wished she could die? Did she begin in the least to realize that her time here was growing short, and that they were trying, these friends of hers, to put by money for the days when there would be no more cake making, and when the expenses of serious illness would be upon them? Constance saw only too plainly that she did not, and was filled with pain and anxiety about it all. She had been permitted once and again, and yet again, to win a soul for Christ. Twice she had heard those who were bidding good-bye to earth say that because of her help they were sure they were going home. But this one, this strange, childish woman with her fitful ways and her passionate, wilful heart, would hear very little about that Christ-centered life which Constance craved for her. "Don't talk to me about such things," she would say petulantly. "I never understood religion, and I'm sure I'm gloomy enough now and have trouble enough without having to hear of it. I shall have to die, of course, when the time comes, and goodness knows I have wished for it often enough. But why can't I be let alone until then? No, I don't want any religion to live by. I have trouble enough without it. I had an Aunt Maria once who was very good. She said she lived her religion every day, and I just detested her. I remember telling Mother that if Aunt Maria was going to heaven, I never wanted to." And then she would laugh like a gleeful child over her folly, and succeed in putting the subject away so completely that no immediate return to it could be made. Yet there came to her days of gloom and hours of passionate abandonment to grief, like one in the throes of a great remorse or a great fear. Constance, studying these outbursts, decided that the cause was fear, that the poor woman realized that her disease was making progress, and that death, which she had so often and so wildly invoked, and yet had always feared and dreaded, was near at hand. It was true that her quiet life and regular and nourishing food, as well as her freedom from immediate anxiety with regard to her child, had helped to hold the disease in check. Still, she must see for herself that it had only been checked, not cured, and that the end could not be far distant. Being childish and whimsical in all her reasonings, she might imagine that to talk about what she called gloomy subjects would hasten the end. If she could only in some way be made to understand that religion was an everyday matter, and had to do with living. Yet, as the days passed, it seemed to Constance that she made no progress whatever toward what had now become her strongest desire. Pauline had hours, or rather moments, when she lavished upon her the strongest expressions of love and confidence, and perhaps in the next second would push her from her and break into passionate and incoherent expressions of self-reproach and self-pity. Some experience of this sort was sure to follow any effort on Constance's part to lead her thoughts toward the claims of Christ upon herself. Mrs. Bristow had a theory of her own. "I believe," she would say with a shrewd look at Constance, that poor creature has got something on her mind that is tormenting her day and night. I've thought so 100 times. If she could only bring herself to tell it all out straight, then I guess she could get the consent of her conscience to listen to something else." All this puzzled and distressed Constance, but she felt powerless, and could only wait and watch and pray. It was well for her that she realized, at least to some extent, what tremendous forces in behalf of this frail woman she was able to set at work by the use of that one instrument, prayer. Meantime, they were all looking forward to the coming of spring. It chanced that the winter was unusually severe and prolonged, which served to make them more eager for the first breath of spring. "This poor creature is housed up so much," would Mrs. Bristow affirm, after an unusually trying day. "No wonder she gets so nervous and persnickety. There hasn't been a living thing that suited her this day except cake. It is wonderful how she takes to cake. But then we always take to things that we can do a little better than anybody else. When she can get out and see the grass growing and smell a flower now and then, she will feel better. And it will be better for Charlie, too, poor little man. She hadn't a mite of patience with him today, not a mite, and he was as good as gold, too." But it came to pass that when spring appeared suddenly one morning, quite as though she had just thought of it the night before and resolved to rush right in, behold, the poor weakling for whom they had desired her coming, drooped. Suddenly her strength gave way, so that she was not only unable to make her beloved cakes, but turned against them, telling Constance to put the measuring cups and the baking tins and the egg beater all away. She never wanted to see or hear of them again. That mood passed, and there came a breathless morning, wherein she cried to be permitted to make one more angel cake, and persisted, in the face of earnest entreaties to the contrary. The result was that her strength failed in a critical moment, and the cake was spoiled in the baking. Her passion of disappointment and chagrin over this trivial accident were so extreme as to induce an exhaustion that was prolonged and alarming. It was then that good Mother Bristow, who had been alone with her patient all the morning, resolved to take matters in charge with a more determined hand. Constance had taken up her afternoon appointment, and had hurried home at noon because she had seen in the morning that Pauline was weaker than usual, and had given her afternoon to trying to undo the mischief that had been wrought in her absence. But the grown-up child had resented being cared for, and the afternoon had been very hard for both patient and nurse. "Look here," Mrs. Bristow said, detaining Constance as she was hurrying from the late tea-table back to her charge. "Wait a minute. Kate is with the poor creature, you know. She can amuse her for a while, if anybody can. And I want to talk a little common sense to you. This kind of thing can't go on much longer, can it? You see, she thinks I'm only the woman of whom you rent rooms, and she naturally kind of resents my interference. I don't know as it is strange, but this isn't the first time she has had her own way and taken the consequences. Isn't it time something was done?" Constance owned that she had but that morning thought that her engagements must be given up for a time, and that she must give herself entirely to taking care of her charge. "Well, you won't do it," said Mrs. Bristow with firmness. "Not if you are the sensible woman I think you are. You need the money you are earning, of course, and times are coming pretty fast, I am afraid, when we shall need a good deal. And it will be a good deal harder on you to stay at home than it will to be at work. Now, I should like to ask you right out plain and square one question, and you won't think I'm meddling, will you? Is this woman any of your kith and kin, or isn't she?" A flush of pain and shame crept slowly over Constance's face, but she answered steadily in the negative. "I thought as much. She is just a neighbor that fell among thieves, isn't she? Well, now I want to ask one question more. Ain't I a neighbor too? What makes you think you've got to hold me at arm's length and make me belong to the family of that worthless priest or that miserable Levite when I don't want to a bit?" "My dear Mrs. Bristow," said Constance, wondering and compelled to laugh, "what can you mean? Is there anything more that you could have done to prove how hearty and unselfish and constant is your neighborliness?" "Yes," said the good woman sturdily, "there is, a good deal more. Don't I know how you watch me all the time, and won't give me a chance to spend a penny of my own money, even for the boy? And don't you hurry home earlier than you want to, for fear I'm being hindered by looking after them a little? And don't you insist upon doing all the watching and trotting after you get here? I don't like it, and I'm not going to stand it. I'm going to be a real out-and-out neighbor after this. We are poor, I know, but we aren't so poor as that. I've got a little money laid by that I've a right to use for them that fell among thieves, and I want a chance to use it. And I've got a good deal of strength and considerable time on my hands that I want to use in the same way. What's to hinder your taking me into partnership in this business and letting us share and share alike? I think Pauline has got where she would be willing to give right up for a while and not do anything for herself or her boy, if you'd just tell her that she needed the rest and that you'd hired me to take care of her and look after him. That will make smooth sailing for us both, and I'll risk but that I can keep things ship shape, and let you go on with your work for a little while. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Nurse Watkins. There were very few times indeed, during those years of Constance's life, when she released her self-control and gave way to tears. Her wound was too deep, too sore, for many tears, but on rare occasions they came as a flood, and relieved the tension for a little while. On this May evening, when heart and body were alike tired, she let her head droop on Mrs. Bristow's ample shoulder, and gave the tears their way, the motherly woman patting and soothing her quite as she, on rare occasions, had a chance to do for the manly boy, Charlie. "There, there, poor tired child, don't cry. Mother didn't mean to be cross and scold. She was only trying to show you that you mustn't be selfish and stubborn and do all the neighboring yourself. Yes, you may cry if you want to. I guess it will rest you. A real downright cry once in a while, especially when folks are young, helps amazingly. You see, you don't give tears half a chance. You keep them choked up there in your heart until they burn you." Constance's emotion ended in laughter. Then she did what was almost as unusual with her as tears. She kissed Mrs. Bristow once and again, lingeringly, tenderly, as she said in a voice that was still not far from tears, "Thank you, dear friend. We will be neighbors together, even more than we have been. I can accept at your hands as freely as you give. And God bless you for all that you have been and are to me." After that, for several weeks, life was less hard for them all. It was not until afterward that they realized one reason for this in Pauline's growing weakness. As Mrs. Bristow had surmised, she took kindly to the proposed rest, even to the giving up of all responsibility about her boy. It seemed natural for her to be waited upon, and her extreme feebleness certainly furnished legitimate excuse. She gave much less trouble than she had while attempting to exert herself, and would lie for hours in an apathetic state, staring apparently at space and thinking her own thoughts. Gloomy thoughts they must chiefly have been, for her face was sad, and at times the lines about her mouth were hard. Too often these periods of silent introspection ended in passionate outbursts that seemed to be as much of anger as of grief. But Mrs. Bristow was learning to manage her charge, and treated her at all times now, not as a naughty, but as a tired child, who had had a great deal to trouble her, and needed to be rested and petted. By the time Constance returned at night, the outbursts had generally spent themselves, and comparative calm reigned. The shrewd woman at the helm, having nothing more to gain by detailing experiences, kept their trials as much as possible to herself, and gave Constance what rest she could. But this state of things was not to last. As the season advanced, and the early, fitful days of May settled into steady balminess, and June was at the door, their patient, instead of improving, grew daily weaker. The doctor who had been "looking in occasionally" for several weeks, warned Mrs. Bristow one morning that if her lodger had any friends to be summoned, it ought to be done soon. She was liable to slip away now at any time. The news took Constance unawares at last. She had not realized that the slipping away would be so soon. She gave up all outside engagements at once, and remained with her charge. The need for constant attendance made this necessary, but there was also another reason. Pauline began to cling to her in a pitiful way, to cry feebly if she left the room for ever so short an absence. And yet, with strange contradiction, there were times when she seemed to be positively irritated by Constance's presence, and would beg her to go away, go to the farther side of the room, where she could not be seen from the bed, only to call her back with nervous haste as soon as this was done. Puzzled and worried and worn, Constance at times knew not what to do or think. There were days when the invalid suffered much pain in addition to her extreme weakness. By degrees the hours became filled with continual efforts to relieve and soothe her, until both nurses were getting physically worn out, and Alice, on her homecoming one Friday evening, voiced the thought in their own hearts that help must be secured. The neighbors were constant in their offers of assistance, but they were all poor and hard-working, needing their day's earnings and their regular rest. "Yes," said Constance, in reply to Alice's urgings, "we must have a nurse. I have been holding back as long as possible, on account of the expense, but your mother at least must rest, and she cannot be persuaded to do so while I am alone." "You must both rest," said Alice, tenderly. "And we can afford a nurse, Ellen. You forget that I am earning money, too. Will you talk with the doctor about it when he comes tonight?" But it came to pass that help of just the kind needed was not to be had on the moment, and they reached the late afternoon of an unusually warm and unusually trying day with the prospect of a hard night before them, and only themselves to depend upon. Earlier in the day Constance had escaped for a few minutes and gone to see a woman of whom she had thought, in the hope of securing her help, only to find that she was herself ill and in need of care. "I met a very wholesome and attractive-looking young woman on the way home," Constance said to Mrs. Bristow. "She seemed attracted to me, too. At least, she looked hard at me, and gave me the impression that I had seen her somewhere before. I was tempted to stop her, stranger though she was, and ask if she knew of any unemployed nurse. She turned, after a few minutes, and walked back this way, and certainly seemed interested in me. She must be a woman whom I have met at some of the houses." The doorbell rang often that afternoon. The neighbors were very sympathetic and solicitous. Mrs. Bristow stood in the doorway with one of them when a trim young woman passed, walking very slowly. Mrs. Bristow's voice was clear and distinct, and this is what she was saying: "I am sorry to say that Mrs. Curtis isn't any better. She had a bad night, and she's had a bad day. Ellen is almost beat out. I dread the night for her." The trim young woman had stopped to tie the lacing of her shoe that seemed to have got out of order. A few more questions and answers involving the repetition of Mrs. Curtis's name, an earnestly expressed wish on the part of the neighbor that she could help them, and the assurance that she would in a minute if her baby wasn't sick, and the interview ended. It was perhaps 10 minutes before the bell rang again. "Dear, dear!" said Mrs. Bristow, who was on her way upstairs. "A body would think that bell had 20 tongues today instead of 1." She answered it herself, and came face to face with the trim young woman whose shoe had arrested her in front of the door. "Good evening, ma'am," she said briskly. "I heard that you had sickness here, and had been looking for help. I wonder if I couldn't be of use. I am a nurse, ma'am, and just home from my last case. I'll be glad to come right in and help, if you are needing someone, and if there is anything I can do." "Well, now," said Mrs. Bristow, "I believe that is a providence. We do need help, that's a fact. You just let me call Ellen Stewart. I shouldn't wonder if she would be glad enough to have you stay this very night, if you can. She needs rest about as bad as anybody ever did in this world." Constance might herself have been a nurse, judging from her general appearance. Her dress was black, but she wore a white apron that completely covered it, and her hair was brushed plainly back from a face that was pale and showed traces of much loss of sleep. In all respects she looked as unlike the Constance of the past as outward circumstances could make her. She instantly recognized the trim young woman as the one who had attracted her earlier in the day, and telegraphed this fact to Mrs. Bristow, who left Kate with the sleeping patient while she came to add her word, if necessary, to the securing of immediate help. "I don't care if she charges $40 a week," she had murmured to Kate. "I like her looks, and I believe we ought to have her. She won't be needed long." But it chanced that terms and references were eminently satisfactory, and the nurse expressed her willingness to take charge that night. "I have a very important errand that must be done right away, ma'am," she explained. "I'll go out right now and do it, and then I'll get my bag and come back here for the night. It won't take me an hour." Mrs. Bristow promptly offered her youngest daughter's services for the errand and the bag, but the nurse assured her that she must attend to the errand herself. "Just let me take your street and number," she said, "so I'll be sure to make no mistake, and I'll get round here again before you know it." As she spoke, she produced from her pocket a pencil and a slip of paper, and wrote the address with exceeding care. Then Mrs. Bristow watched her taking businesslike strides toward the nearest car, and felt a strange letting up of the burden of responsibility that had been oppressing her. "It's queer how you trust some folks, even if they are strangers," she murmured to herself. "I know that woman will come back, and I know she'll be a blessing. I feel it all through me." Half an hour later, the new nurse presented herself at a district telegraph office, and a few minutes thereafter there clicked over the wires a message addressed to Mr. Charles Gordon Curtis, which read as follows: "Come to the street and number signed to this, as soon as you can get here. Ask for Nurse Watkins. Dilsey." By 9 of the clock that evening, Mrs. Bristow's house had settled into quiet. Constance in her own room was sleeping the sleep of one exhausted and relieved from responsibility. Mrs. Bristow was snoring comfortably in her room, with little Charlie on a cot beside her. And in the sick room, Nurse Watkins sat erect and watchful by the bedside of a sleeping woman whose name she knew was Pauline. During the next 4 days, that household learned to bless the name of Nurse Watkins. "Ah, yes," the doctor had said, when Mrs. Bristow described her. "I know Nurse Watkins. She was with a patient of mine over on Spring Street, and proved herself a treasure. She went to the country with a sick woman, and I did not know she had returned. She isn't what is called a professional nurse, but for some cases she is even better. I do not know of any one who could meet your needs here so well as she can. I'm very glad you found her." "The Lord found her," said Mrs. Bristow reverently, "and sent her to us, I believe." As the days passed she grew sure of it. Pauline also took to the new attendant, wanted her ministrations, liked to be left alone with her, and never shrank from her, as she still had at times a strange wild way of doing with Constance. One wakeful night they talked together, the sick woman and Nurse Watkins. Talked and talked. The nurse, instead of trying to quiet her patient, led her on. Sometimes her words were like the ravings of one insane, and sometimes she cried and moaned. Once she said, "I can't do it, nurse. I tell you I can't. You might tell her after I am gone. I've told it all to you, and it's only a little while now. She has been, oh, so good to me, like an angel, and I cannot have her hate me yet. I must have her by me to the end. Don't you know I must, nurse? I cannot die without her holding my hand, and it's only such a little while. And you know she would hate me." "No, she wouldn't hate you," said Nurse Watkins, quiet and cool. "She would stay by you just the same. She belongs to the Lord, and it is loving the Lord Jesus and copying him all the time that has made her good to you. She will always be good to you, and you won't get any peace or feel anything but afraid till you tell her what you know you ought to." And then, by and by, there was praying. Nurse Watkins had learned how to pray. She prayed a great deal during those hours. Sometimes for the sick woman to follow, and sometimes for only God to hear. In this way passed those fateful nights in which Nurse Watkins took sole command and ordered the other 2 women to their beds. "I'm used to it," she would say cheerfully. "I can sleep standing up in the daytime whenever there's a chance. But you need your rest so as to be fresh for tomorrow. This dear lady wants to talk to you tomorrow. She has got something special that she wants to tell you." And then Pauline would wail out, "Oh, no, nurse, don't say that. I can't." And then the cool, quiet hand of the nurse would come about her head and smooth back the rumpled hair, and rearrange the tossed pillows, and her voice would murmur low, "You will be a little stronger by and by, and God will help you to do what is right. He loves you and is waiting to give you every bit of help you need." On the 4th afternoon following the nurse's coming, Constance did not leave the sick room for a moment. The nurse had warned her that the end was drawing near. "I don't think she'll get through the night, ma'am. She may, but I don't think it. I should not be surprised if she went out with the day. If I were you, I would stay close by her and encourage her to talk. It can't hurt her now, and I think it will help her. I don't believe she can die in peace until she tells you some things that she ought to have told long ago." Constance looked at her with wide, startled eyes, and Nurse Watkins, who had learned a great deal since she became a nurse, added quietly, "You see, ma'am, she has talked to me and told me things. They always do to nurses, you know, if they take to them at all. And there are things that you ought to know. I will tell you all about them if she doesn't, but I hope she will. That is what is holding her back from peace. She could rest herself on the Lord Jesus if it was off her mind, but she can't before, because she knows she isn't doing right. So for her sake, you see, ma'am. She thinks you would be angry with her, but I've told her the folly of that, and I really think she will talk to you before she goes. She almost promised me. And you won't mind my being in the room, ma'am? For she says that I must hold her hand. She's like a sick child, you see, and has taken a notion." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. At last. One other direction Nurse Watkins gave, this time to Mrs. Bristow. "I'm expecting a call, ma'am, a very important one, and I must see the man myself. I feel pretty sure he can get here today, and I want to know, if it should be so that I couldn't leave her, will you let him come up into the hall, near the door, so I can see him and tell him what to do? It is very important indeed. I'll explain it all to you afterward, but I wouldn't have any mistake about it this time for the world." Mrs. Bristow promised readily, unquestioningly. Her thoughts were busy with the coming of that other silent guest into her household. Besides, she had learned, even in so short a time, to do Nurse Watkins's bidding. And so they waited. The sick woman was quieter that day, quieter than she had ever been. She slept much and grew steadily weaker. Once or twice the watchers bending over her thought that the breath had stopped, but Nurse Watkins shook her head and watched the door leading into the hall. It stood open, as did all the doors, for better air. Toward the sun setting the dying woman roused a little, opened her eyes, and fixed them steadily upon Constance, then reached out a small, wasted hand to clasp hers. "You won't hate me?" she asked, each word being slow and distinct. "Dear child," said Constance, her eyes filling with tears, "why should you think of such a thing for a moment? Don't you know that I know," said the sick one, interrupting her words. "You have been good to me. No angel could be better. But, you see, you do not know. She knows," turning her eyes for a moment on Nurse Watkins's face, "she knows all about it, and she says I must tell you. But, oh, I am afraid, even now. No one was ever good to Charlie and me except you, and I thought you would not believe me. You would think I made it all up. Still, I'm going to tell you now. I promised that I would. She says God wants me to. But you will stay by me every minute, won't you, even after that? Are you sure you can?" "Every minute," said Constance solemnly. "Well, then—" She gave a kind of gasp as one whose breath was failing, and waited. The room was very still. But there was a very little, stir in the hall. There had been a step on the stairs that Nurse Watkins had heard. She had her eyes on the doorway. Kate Bristow telegraphed them, and Nurse Watkins shook her head. She could not stir from her post. Her fingers were watching the pulse of the dying. Then she, too, sent a telegram with her eyes to a man, a stranger, who stood very near the door. He was to wait there. Suddenly the dying woman broke the silence, her words clear and almost loud, as though she had summoned all her powers for one last effort. "He was the wrong man." The great thuds that Constance's heart was giving, it seemed to her, must be heard by every one present, but she steadied her voice to utmost quiet and gentleness. "Do you mean, dear, that you want me to know that you are not Mrs. Curtis?" "No," said the dying, her voice fairly filling the room. "Not that. I am Mrs. Curtis, Mrs. Charles Gordon Curtis. God knows that that is true, and nurse knows it. But it wasn't your husband. I saw him that day. He didn't see me. I saw what an awful mistake I had made, and I ran away. I thought you would come back to him that day, and everything would be right except for Charlie and me. It was a long, long time afterward that I found that you didn't go back. So long that I thought it would do no good then to tell anybody. And then you found me that night, you know, and I saw that you didn't understand. I meant to tell you, but, oh, you were so good to Charlie and me, and I didn't know how we could live without you, and I knew you would hate me if I told the truth, and I was afraid. I didn't see how it could do you any good to know after all these years, and—" The voice stopped. Cold drops had gathered on her forehead, and her cold hand that Constance held was trembling. "Speak to her," said Nurse Watkins, and Constance, not less pale than the dying, bent over her while she clasped the small, cold hand in both of hers. "Don't try to tell me any more, dear. You have not strength, and there is no need. God loves you and forgives you, and he will give you rest forever. Think of him now. Think of the loving, waiting Jesus, and rest in his strength. And Pauline, I will take care of Charlie for you as long as I live, and love him for you, and he'll come up to heaven some day and be with you." She never forgot the look of love that overspread the dying face. But it was on Nurse Watkins that those great, solemn eyes turned a last look as her voice gathered strength for one more word. "It is true, nurse, what you said. The Lord Jesus is good. I can trust him." The room grew very still. The sun dropped low and lower and sank away. The soft summer twilight crept up and began to fill the air. Outside in the hall the stranger waited. He had changed his position once so that his eyes could take in the form of Constance as she sat with her back to the door, her hand clasped in the grip of one that had taken its last hold of things earthly. Alice Bristow stole in presently, leading Charlie by the hand. Only a little while before he had given his mother what he knew were good-bye kisses. His beautiful eyes were dimmed with much weeping. Mrs. Bristow clasped her motherly arms about him, but after a minute he went softly away from her, and got down on his knees, and laid his head on Constance's lap, and her free hand moved with infinite tenderness of caress among his brown curls. And so they waited. If one could only picture thoughts! Oh, the tide of pain and joy, of hope and grief, of gratitude and shame, that surged through Constance Curtis's heart. He was true! True! He had been true and good and grand from the very first, and through all this eternity of time. If, oh, if she had but trusted him! God forgive her! Could God ever forgive her for bowing that dear head to the dust in shame and agony? Could she dare sometime, when they were old, and his pain had dulled, to seek him and bowing at his feet beg his forgiveness? Oh, if this poor soul had only told the truth, just simply the truth, from the very first! Stop, she must not think of that. She must not think at all. She must not faint. She must let this dying hand keep hold of something warm and human to the very last. She must pray, pray, and not for herself, but for the passing soul. God, in infinite mercy, receive this poor, wronged, sinning, suffering, sorrowing, repentant woman, and give her the rest and the strength that her child heart needs. O God of patience everlasting, of grace infinite, revealed to us in Jesus Christ, hold us all. Nurse Watkins's eyes had been on the dying. They turned at this moment and reached into the hall. They met the eyes of Gordon Curtis and signaled him forward. The passing soul was beyond all danger now of any earthly shock. He came softly once more into the presence of death. The last time that he and Nurse Watkins had met had been on that morning when she had stood with him beside the clay of his cousin Charles, and had murmured to him, "The breath has stopped." Now, after a moment, she said, low-toned, again for his ear, "It is over." Instantly he bent and took Constance Curtis in his arms, and said, "My wife, my darling, at last!" 2 days afterward they went home, Mr. and Mrs. Curtis and little Charlie holding close by the hand Nurse Watkins, whose special charge he had already become. For Nurse Watkins had suddenly lost her interest in hospitals and hotels and boarding houses and a roving life generally, and was quite ready to go home. She was more than ready to promise to live and move and have her being hereafter for Charlie's sake. "You see, I've lived for them so long," she explained to the bewildered Mrs. Bristow, who wanted to hear volumes from this well-informed woman's lips. "I've had them on my mind day and night, as you may say, for such a great while, that I don't know as I could set myself to really doing anything that would keep me from thinking about them. The housework and the mending and the nursing and one thing and another that I've appeared to be doing all this time were only kind of wedges, don't you see, to get me in where I wanted to be for the sake of my real work. And now that that's done, at last, I feel kind of lost. Or I would if it wasn't for Charlie. I'm real glad he takes to me, and wants me along with him all the time, and that they do too." Where have I been? Dear me, all over the world, you may say. I crossed the ocean once, if you'll believe it. Yes, I did, and was gone for near 3 months. He took a notion that maybe she had gone over there where he used to be. I don't know why he thought so. I never did. I kind of felt in my bones all the while that she was in this country. "Oh, no, ma'am, I can't say that I had any plan about my hunting. Not that can be told, anyway. The only thing I was bound and determined to do was to find her, and I thought when I began that it would be easy work enough, but before I got half through I had a good deal of respect for those detectives that failed. Why, the way I came on her track at last was just one of those little happenings that there's no accounting for, if folks don't believe in Providence and prayer and things of that kind. I had just got in from the country, where I'd been to nurse a woman through a fever, and the way I came to do that was because I heard two women in a drug store where I'd gone after some arnica, talking about her, and they called her Mrs. Curtis. Of course, that set me off. I managed to find out where she lived, and I took the first train out there to see if I could be of any help, as a nurse, you know. They were glad enough to get help, and I stayed and nursed her through. She was Mrs. Curtis all right, but not my Mrs. Curtis, I can tell you. Wasn't a mite like her. Still, don't you know, I kept thinking that maybe, being the same name, she was connected with the family in some way, and might know something about things. It took me a week or two to make sure that she hadn't a thing to do with our Curtises in any way, and I kind of chafed over the time I was wasting there. But she was an awful sick woman, and it didn't seem right to leave them, especially as they got to depending on me, so I stayed and saw her through. Stayed a whole week after I had said that I had got to go, because they felt so bad about it that I couldn't somehow get away. Now, see how things work. If I had come away a day earlier, I suppose I would have missed her. That very morning that I came in from the country, I followed a little scamp of a boy away out to this neighborhood before I went to my rooms or anywhere, because he said he had a grown-up sister Pauline who was dying of starvation. She wasn't dying at all, and for that matter he hadn't any sister anyway. The fact is, there wasn't a word of truth in any of his stories, and just as I was turning away, feeling mad, I came face to face with her. "Not with Ellen!" exclaimed the excited audience. "With Mrs. Curtis, ma'am, Mrs. Charles Gordon Curtis. They belong to the oldest family in our city, and the most respected, the Curtises do. Yes, I came face to face with her, right there in the street, and knew her in an instant, for all she was in a kind of disguise, as you may say. I've got something about me that won't let me forget a face, and I knew I should remember her face anyhow. She was coming out of a house 3 squares below here on the right-hand side." "Mrs. Bent's house," murmured Mrs. Bristow. "She went over there to see if she could get help, and to think that I begged her to let me go in her place while she lay down and rested a bit." "There!" said Nurse Watkins in triumphant answer to this. "See how things work. Well, of course, I followed her to this house, and then I hung about, keeping watch of it so that no one could go in or out without my knowing it, and trying to plan what to do next that wouldn't look too queer, and so spoil everything. I tried to get some word at the next house, but there didn't seem to be anybody at home, and I hadn't decided just what to do when you came to the door yourself and helped me out. You talked about Mrs. Curtis being so sick, and though I couldn't see how she could be walking the streets and yet be like what you was telling, thinks I to myself, any kind of sickness gives me a chance. So I waited till you got back in the house, and then a neighbor came home, and I asked some questions, and found you had been looking for help. That made the way clear enough, and I just rang the bell and sailed in. And if anybody can go through all that I have, and not believe in Providence that plans things for you, then I think it shows that they were born an idiot." When Nurse Watkins was much excited, her grammar was inclined to grow a trifle mixed. "I think as much," declared Mrs. Bristow, who lived during those 2 days in such a continual maze of bewilderment that, to use her own expression, she felt sometimes as though she were "walking on her head." "You could have knocked me down with a feather," she affirmed. "When that splendid-looking stranger put his arms around Ellen and called her his wife. You see, I thought all the time that he was waiting for you to come and help save somebody's life, and that he meant to snatch you away the minute that poor soul was gone. I never once thought of his knowing Ellen." He knew Mrs. Curtis, ma'am, of course, the second his eyes rested on her, in spite of that queer dress, which wasn't much like what she had been used to, I can tell you. You ought to have seen her when she was a bride." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29, the final chapter of Pauline by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29, Home. In such ways did Nurse Watkins do what she could to keep the dignity of Mrs. Charles Gordon Curtis before the bewildered minds of her auditors. Mrs. Bristow, however, after the first shock of amazement had passed, was generally able to aid and abet her. In truth, she rolled on her tongue as sweet morsels Nurse Watkins's scraps of knowledge that witnessed to the future magnificence of her dear Ellen. Especially did she delight in talking it all over afterward, when her eyes had been still more widely opened. And in skillful ways known to herself, she managed that Mrs. Emerson, and above all, Mr. Henry Emerson, should have abundant knowledge in these directions. Some of her items were after this manner. "Yes, of course he is Charles Gordon Curtis the lawyer. There was never but one black sheep in all that family, they say, and he was the one who made all the trouble, poor wretch. But this one belongs to the great law firm, and rich. Oh, dear me, you should hear Nurse Watkins describe the house where Ellen is to live. My Alice will be able to tell you all about it. She is going to spend next winter with them. For that matter, I and the girls are going on with her, just for a little visit. I thought we'd better wait another year, but Ellen simply wouldn't hear to it. Yes, I know, traveling is rather expensive, but we don't need to worry about that. You see, Mr. Curtis has got a notion that we were very good to his wife, instead of her being a blessing to us every minute, and he can't do enough to show his gratitude. It's ridiculous the way he goes on. What do you say to a check for $1,000 at one dash? That was exactly what he left in my hand when he told me good-bye. It was wrapped in a scrap of paper that said on it, "A slight token of gratitude and an earnest of what I hope to do in the future to prove it." I'm sure I don't know what he can do next. Money isn't of so much consequence, of course, compared with other things. We all know that. But then, when you've got all the other things, and that too, it isn't to be despised. I won't deny that I'm glad my Alice, and the younger girls too for that matter, are to have some of the advantages that grow out of it. In these ways did Mrs. Bristow successfully supplement Nurse Watkins's efforts to make known the proper society estimate in which her friends were held. Pauline went home too, traveling in state in her silver-bound, satin-lined house that said on its massive plate, "Pauline, wife of Charles Gordon Curtis, aged 25 years." She had her rights at last. The Curtis honors for its dead were all bestowed with most punctilious care, the surviving Gordon Curtis and his wife having an almost superstitious longing to make, thus, what atonement they could to the poor, wasted clay that they were bearing to its stately resting place, for all that sin had made it to suffer. They went, after the solemn ceremonies were over, to the hotel where Constance had been taken as a bride, and to the very rooms so fraught with strange memories. And the first words that Constance said after the door closed upon the retreating clerk were, "Oh, poor Pauline!" Nurse Watkins did not occupy her old room on the 7th floor back, but was established in one that opened from Mrs. Curtis's dressing room, and Charlie's bed stood in a lace-curtained alcove, so near at hand that nurse could put forth her hand at night and cover her charge. The chambermaids and the elevator boys had all come in since Dilsey's reign, and were most respectful to Nurse Watkins, and careful of her comfort. But the clerk of the house smiled on her familiarly one morning, and said, "Well, Dilsey, I hear you have been living a 3-volume novel. Are you going to write it out for us?" "No." said Nurse Watkins with lofty dignity. "I shall keep my stories for them to whom they belong." They remained 3 days at the hotel, while Mrs. Reefer and her retinue of helpers were making ready the Curtis homestead for its mistress, days which Mr. Curtis devoted entirely to getting acquainted over again with his wife, and in which they told in minutest detail the story of their separate experiences, at least so far as it could be put into words. And one June day the Curtis carriage drew up before the hotel, and little Charlie and Nurse Watkins and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Gordon Curtis entered it and were driven home. It was just as the sun was setting that Mr. Curtis opened, for the first time in 3 years, the door of his wife's sitting room and led her toward his mother's picture. Mrs. Reefer had been true to the smallest details of arrangement. Everything, even the bit of yellowed muslin in the work-basket with its needle thrust into it, and the gold thimble waiting for its new owner's hand, were there. So also was his mother's Bible, opened to that remembered verse, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Constance had heard all about it from her husband, how he had planned and arranged and perfected everything on that day 3 years before, and had knelt at his mother's chair and repeated solemnly the Bible words, and consecrated the home anew to his mother's God, and how he had turned back to look at his mother's pictured face with the glory of the sunset light overspreading it, and had said aloud, "When I come again, I will bring Constance," and how impossible it had been for him to come again without her. As they stood there at last, together, is it any wonder that they saw all things through a mist of tears? Yet they were grateful tears. The first words that Mr. Curtis spoke were an echo of inspiration realized once more in human experience. "He hath showed me his marvelous loving kindness." And then they knelt together beside his mother's chair, with his mother's kind eyes smiling down upon them. When Gordon Curtis had knelt there before and spoken solemn words of consecration, it had been but lip service, sentiment. Today he came with his whole soul. Both of them remembered in that solemn moment the boy Charlie, and the strange way in which he had come into their lives, and the sacred trust that had thus been thrust upon them. Was not the Lord's hand in it all? Is it strange that the prayer began, "To the Lord that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and of the shadow of death, and brought us home, we dedicate this home anew to thy service. We ask to be kept within these walls from word or act or thought that shall dishonor thee. We give our home, our means, our time, our strength, ourselves, to thee in everlasting grateful service." The last rays of the setting sun came again and lighted up the smiling picture, and wrapped the 2 kneeling figures in its glory, and they both knew and felt that in a peculiar and never to be forgotten sense, they had at last reached home. And it was the 21st of June. End of chapter 29. End of Pauline by Pansy. Recorded by TriciaG. Thanks for listening.